Greetings everyone. This is a quick promo before the video begins. If you're new to the channel and you didn't know it yet, I am actually an author in addition to being a YouTuber, and I have 2 books that you can get on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1 and The Occult Mafia. The first is sort of a bizarre, absurdist kaiju anime mashup, and the other is a horror noir story with a hint of a western thrown in there. They're both set in the same universe, and at this point have received mostly positive reviews, so you might want to check them out. I've provided Amazon links for both of them down in the description. They're both available in either paperback or Amazon Kindle, and Operation Red Dragon is also available in audiobook form. So if either of these strike your fancy and you want to support a struggling artist, feel free to go down and check out either one or both of them. Alright, the shameless self-promotion is out of the way, we can get on with the video. Thank you all for your support. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and I am a fan of Blue Oyster Cult. I'm such a fan, in fact, that I did a retrospective of every single studio album the band ever released, since I also happen to own all of them on CD. Recently I capped this off with a look at The Symbol Remains, the album we never thought we'd get. I thought that meant I was done, but it turns out I was wrong. There is another chapter in this saga, or rather a companion piece, and it is absolutely worth discussing. But first you need to know the backstory, because if you don't understand the past, you can't fully comprehend the present. That's just a general bit of good advice anyway. I did already kinda go over this in the Blue Oyster Cult retrospective, but for those of you coming in late, here's the lowdown. In his youth, Sandy Pearlman wrote a collection of narrative poems entitled The Soft Doctrines of Imaginos. These poems wove a complex tapestry that combined real-world history with mysticism and ancient astronaut theory, forming a pseudo-Lovecraftian tale of conspiracies and intrigue. The main character is Imaginos, sometimes called Destinova, who subtly influences the course of human history on behalf of godlike extraterrestrials, to whom our lives are little more than an elaborate game to amuse themselves with. When Pearlman became a music producer, he assembled Eric Bloom, Donald Buck Dharma Roser, Alan Lehner, and brothers Albert and Joe Bouchard into the band Blue Oyster Cult, with the understanding that, in addition to writing their own material, they would also adapt the Imaginos poems into a rock opera one day. While plenty of the poems were adapted into songs over most of the band's albums, the only one interested in the rock opera idea was Albert, and due to the democratic way the band did things, he was always outvoted when he proposed committing to a concept album. In 1981, Albert officially left the band. As breakups go, it wasn't the messiest in rock and roll history, but it did generate a little animosity. Still, once he was solo, Albert immediately began working with Sandy to finally make that Imaginos concept album a reality. It would be released under his name as a solo project and was intended to be a triple-length epic packed with guest musicians and singers, including Alan and Brother Joe. What follows is one of the most frustrating tales in music history. The production quickly went over budget and kept getting stalled by rewrites and re-recordings. In fact, there were so many that there's still debate as to how much each credited musician actually contributed to the final product. The execs at Columbia Records were losing patience. Albert and Sandy negotiated for a chance to finish the album, which they got, but compromises had to be made. First, the album had to be cut from triple length to single length, and second, it had to be a Blue Oyster Cult album, which meant bringing Eric and Buck in for vocals. This was a bit awkward for 2 reasons. First, Eric and Buck weren't on good terms with Albert since the split, and second, they still had no interest in the project. They only agreed to it because they felt they owed it to Sandy. He did get their careers started after all. As a result, Imaginos would become the last Blue Oyster Cult album to feature the original lineup in its entirety. So the album was finally finished, and then the studio butchered it so horribly that even Leatherface would have been appalled. Several songs were cut, the remaining songs were arranged out of order, and the album was spat out into record stores with hardly any fanfare. It was a flop, and thus it became an excuse for Columbia to kick the Cult and Albert to the curb. To add insult to injury, the original release would go out of print quickly and not see another release until 2007. The story of what happened to Blue Oyster Cult after that can be found in the original retrospective, but for now, our focus shall remain on Albert Bouchard. Though discouraged, Albert did not give up on music. He performed with various other acts for the rest of the 80s, and in 1994 he took matters into his own hands. He formed his own independent studio, Selsum Records, and started a new band called the Brain Surgeons. They would release 9 albums between 1994 and 2006, and he would then go on to record various solo albums. Basically, Albert was able to remain active in music and eventually made peace with Eric and Buck, but the shadow of Imaginos always loomed over him. Was that chapter really over, or would he take another shot one day?
Well, the fans certainly hoped it would happen. Long before the demand was put out to release the Snyder Cut of Justice League, Oyster aficionados were hoping for a release of Imaginos in its original form, the way it was meant to be.
Whether it was a special edition of the original album or a brand new recording, it was considered a musical Ark of the Covenant, that which was lost and sought after but might never be found. A semi-bootleg of the original version can be heard, but it's clearly not finished and far from official.
Then came November of 2020. Towards the tail end of an otherwise miserable year, it finally happened.
Just a few weeks after BOC's new album landed, Albert Bouchard released a brand new version of the Lost Rock opera, entitled Reimaginos, and that finally brings us to the album itself.
He did this for Sandy and the fans who never lost faith in the project. Was it worth the wait? There's only one way to find out.
The first thing worth noting is the track listing. Not only is the order different from the original album, but the missing songs have been restored.
Since Albert produced this himself and therefore had complete control over the process, I feel confident in saying this is the intended order.
The songs are split into 4 groupings of 3 songs apiece. These quadrants are respectively entitled Quandary, Sublime, Ghost, and Dance. This new order does help make the story a bit clearer, though given the enigmatic nature of the lyrics, there's still a lot of room for interpretation and head-scratching.
The inclusion of those previously excised songs is the most significant detail because they fill in the holes.
They're not unfamiliar songs, to be clear. Girl That Love Made Blind and Gil Blanco County were originally released when Blue Oyster Cult was called Stock Forest Group, and Black Telescope is a reworking of Workshop of the Telescopes from the first BOC album.
Of course, any other time you may have heard those songs, it was always out of context. Hearing them within the proper narrative is like hearing them for the first time.
Again, there's a degree of lyrical interpretation to be had, but that's part of the fun with the story.
Where the new album differs the most from the original is in the music. I guess the best way of putting it is Reimaginos is the stripped-down version of Imaginos.
The 1988 Imaginos, despite being butchered in other ways, is a very polished auditory experience. It's heavy metal through and through, with an emphasis on electric instruments and only the best-sounding vocal takes.
Like I said in the retrospective, it's great music, and it makes for an enjoyable listening experience in spite of everything else that happened. Reimaginos, however, goes in a very different direction.
There's a stronger emphasis on acoustic instruments with far less processing, and Albert does not try to disguise how much his voice has aged.
The only way to properly demonstrate it is to play excerpts for contrast. Those excerpts will have to be very short in order to keep the YouTube bots from raining down their thunder upon me, but hopefully you'll still get the idea. Roll the clips.
Fresh from zones of moisture,
and afterward the meat.
You see what I mean? There's a rawness to Reimaginos that wasn't on the previous album, or heck, any of the previous Blue Oyster Cult albums.
This leads to the music sounding very different, and in some ways more atmospheric than its predecessor.
The acoustic guitars, for example, provide an eerie gothic atmosphere on songs like Astronomy or In the Presence of Another World, and those songs were already pretty eerie in their original forms. This acoustic styling also lends itself well to Black Telescopes, which now sounds like a proper sea shanty as opposed to its psychedelic original form. Meanwhile, Gil Blanco County is a nice throwback to the early days of BOC when they were still dabbling in country music. Given the context and the setting of the song's narrative, though, it makes perfect sense. You know what's really funny, though? I only listened to Imaginos a couple of times before writing this review, and yet it's still stuck with me. In fact, listening to it is kind of an emotional experience.
The reason I spent so much time telling you the backstory of this album was so you could really understand what it took to get here. The original Imaginos was a dream project, a dream shared by both Albert Bouchard and Sandy Pearlman, and that dream turned into a nightmare when they made a go for it. Sandy passed without ever seeing his original vision fully realized, but Albert kept going forward, and decades later, he not only got to do it again, but it was entirely on his own terms. That's somewhat miraculous.
Earlier I mentioned the rawness of the music and the vocals, and that is especially apparent in Albert's singing.
The lack of polish here means the emotion in his voice is on full display. You can hear something almost indescribable in his singing, something that lets us know what this means to him. There's a palpable sense of relief as the last song concludes, especially when you know the long and arduous backstory.
I've told you all of this not just to review the album, which, as I'm sure you guessed by now, I highly recommend, but also to encourage you. Yes, you, the person watching. This is to encourage you.
This is a story of perseverance and victory against the odds. Albert Bouchard had no reason to believe that he would ever get to realize the soft doctrines of Imaginos the way he wanted to, especially since his first shot was botched so horribly by forces beyond his control. It took ages, sure, but he stayed the course until he could finally make it happen, and the result is well worth it.
Regardless of how well the album does, the fact remains that he did it. And he did it in the midst of a year where very little seems to be going right for anyone.
This should be inspirational in a similar way to Arjen Anthony Lucasen's story, albeit with very different details. Sometimes achieving your goal takes time, and you may have to endure some massive failures along the way, but once it happens, no one can take that accomplishment away from you.
That's what Imaginos represents to me. I've not only enjoyed listening to it, I feel uplifted by its very existence. And my hope is that now you too will feel similarly inspired. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. You know, it was also great that Albert reunited with Blue Oyster Cult for The Symbol Remains, even if it was only for one song. I guess only time will tell if that leads anywhere in the future.
If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Like and subscribe, then go down to the description to find links to follow us on DeviantArt, Patreon, and Twitter. While you're there, you'll also find the Amazon links for the original novels Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, and The Occult Mafia. 2 books I think you'll really enjoy. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.